So, Bijoy, the last time we met was 5.5 years ago in Mumbai when we were both doing the same competition for the City Museum there, and nothing's happened on that side. What's going on?
Yes, so for the moment, the entire project has been put on hold.
The best way to do this is find a common ground, accommodate, all the spaces that might be required or will be wanted from the city, as well as the museum, and find a sort of a structure that in some way enables that. And that would mean, of course, because of the nature of the land and the footprint of the land, it would need to go vertically up. And most of the city is in that mode right now, just because land is of value, density is high. So yes, it kind of reminded me of, of course, the land parcel is much larger, but the Piers Compare by Nino Babardi in Sao Paulo, something like that, where you could actually integrate other programs, other functions. So that's what we spoke about. And I think it would require both parties to come together. Sorry, you were saying something.
I'd just like to pick you up on that, because the kind of notion of a high-rise there for living, I'm imagining, is your proposition, and how certainly the pandemic has thrown up huge questions about the way that we live together and the kind of spaces in which we live together. And many of the people who've suffered the greatest hardship have been living in small, high-rise apartments without an access to gardens. So, and it's just not a sustainable way for people to live. We have space, the luxury of space and nature. It's a need. So how do you imagine a high-rise that is able to resolve those tensions, or indeed is it now a legitimate typology? Is it something that we should question?
I think I would begin with questioning the typology. That's the sort of premise of how to address this, because it's more the codifications of what, how building regulations enable you to do things that you can do, especially within the city. But I would say this would also be applicable to where you are. London, for that matter, also in some ways is a fairly dense city. Of course, the population is not the same as it is out here. But I think it would mean to sort of, in a way, decode and recode the city, where I think what we have to put into the foreground are priorities of, not just quantitative, because I think right now all the codifications are more quantitative in terms of square feet or square meters, and then cost per square feet. And you see billboards with, 1 BHK, which is 1 bedroom, whole kitchen, or 2 BHK. There's a sort of nomenclature that's given. And I would say that I think that we need to redefine what the priorities are. Yes. How, or at least raising the question of, maybe how do we redefine our living spaces of the way.
It's something that I've really been reflecting on, and we have here, there is a kind of let's say a priority is given to efficiency and to what is the minimum space that people can live in, and it seems to be completely the wrong position to start with. I would rather start with what is, let's define the maximum space. Let's be generous. Let's not talk about efficiency, but about well-being, because ultimately well-being will lead to a better society, a happier way of living together. And it's something that is not factored in as a kind of serious criteria, as in expressed in that way. in briefs. And, you know, I look at where you are, and I can see kind of monsoon behind you, and I tell you there's a monsoon happening here too. But you're in nature, and there's this beautiful plant behind you, and how can we bring that sense of nature to high-rise living? Is it really possible?
I think so. I mean, I would say is applicable in a global context too, not just Mumbai context, you know. But if I just take Mumbai as an example, you know, here we have an abundance of water, air, and light. You know, three very fundamental ingredients for well-being. You know, and say if that becomes a premise. Now, everything we do right now is to keep exactly water, air, and light out. You know, we're kind of making hermetically sealed environments. You know, to see the kind of construction that is ongoing right now in the city. But I also see that when I'm in Milan, or for that matter London, you know, I think also the industry has sort of defined or regulated the kind of products, or that's sort of been driven, market driven, in terms of what you're seeing as an expression of building. But for me, yes, the central premise would be, you know, where Mumbai should not have a situation where we have a problem of water. I mean, there's 3,000 millimeters of rain, or that's 3 meters of rain pretty much consistently every year. That's a fairly large amount of water that we get, but we're not able to retain that water. We're on the coast, we're surrounded, we're an island, you know, we're an island at some point. We're surrounded on 3 sides by water. So we have also, you know, light and air. And this is something that I think if one actually codifies, like, you know, regulations that determine ceiling heights, you know, volumes of spaces as the bare minimum. Yes, there's a concern about density, and you have to be, I don't want to say efficient, but more use the word effective. There's got to be an effective way of, you know, an effective economy, you know, as a way to, I think, negotiate these problems. But let me pose this question back to you. Don't you not think the same of where you are?
I feel, yes.
As a city? Because I've lived in London for 3 or 4 years, for 4 years, way back in the early 90s. And there's a sort of concentration of, you know, quality housing in the center of the city, but as you start dispersing and moving further away, you know, that same quality of housing, I feel, begins to sort of slowly decline.
Yeah.
But this is just my observation, and I'm curious to know, you know, how would you approach a similar situation in your context?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, we have a housing crisis in London for sure, and I think there are very few models of housing here that are truly successful in creating, you know, a real sense of community and neighborhood. And I think one thing that has really kind of been thrown into sharp relief is the interconnectedness of everything and everyone through this pandemic. And it kind of reminds me that as architects, we have a responsibility to participate more fully, not just as designers, not just as architects, but we cannot begin to solve these problems unless we're talking to the politicians, to the local authorities, to the developers, to the people, to the investors, to the communities that we are seeking to design for. It has to be a more participatory process. And I think as a profession, we've been far too passive for far too long and become quite reactive, that we're given a brief and then we try and find clever ways around it. But actually, we should be much more involved with everybody else, with all of these groups, to rewrite the limits, as you say, to kind of recode the city, to redefine the limits of what is possible and what is expected. But can I just come to something, because it's, you know, in a sense, I think that there's no one I would rather speak to right now than you as an architect, because your work has always been concerned with locality, with nature, with community. And there's, you know, that Gandhi famously said that the quality of a nation is shown in how we care for our fauna and flora and how we care for the elderly. And your work is exemplary in that respect. And I you know, in the West, we have failed in that respect, and we need to address that. But I'd like to just ask you to kind of develop that and just speak a little bit about whether this kind of trauma that we're all going through, whether it has made you want to reach out in different directions, or if you feel that you are on a quest that is that happens to be very much, you know, of the moment, that is so relevant, that speaks of all those things.
I think we have at least governance here in some way has not been able to negotiate this pandemic. I mean, we've had millions of people, you know, going on foot from the city. I mean, there was an exodus of a few million people from the city not so long ago, walking back from here to, you know, a few thousand kilometers with families, with children, women that were pregnant. So I think what I take from that about you know, the flora, fauna, and the elderly, I think it is about caring for things that are fragile. You know, and when I'm saying fragile, in the sense that how does one work from a space of strength? But how do you remain in, you know, what is the practice to remain in contact while you know, the strength is innate, but to also be connected to things that are unable to respond back in that same, you know, in the way, like when you think about a child or an animal or an elderly, you know, of a forest, or for that matter, you know, these people that have actually, you know, might, you know, move, you know, what they're sort of under the sort of quote migrants. And I think for me, like, what's always been very important in my practice is to look for a space that accommodates these moments where, you know, how do you construct a space that will enable for these to coexist without being on the extremities, you know, without being on the edges, but very much inclusive of that environment. And for me, that's a fundamental aspect of my practice. Has the COVID in some way, or this situation that we are in, and I feel that COVID is just one of the many that we're going to be confronted with. You know, there's a looming climate crisis that, you know, right now is, you know, I wouldn't say we're distracted, but it's not, it's pretty much right above us. It is, you know, so this situation that we're in, compounded with a climate crisis, compounded with a prejudice that exists sort of globally, you know, and I think, yeah, how do we find ways and means that will make spaces that, or places that will in some way disempower these forces? I think that's the question that is what we're being asked, if I understand what you have provoked here. I think that's a long process. It's not all going to happen overnight, but I think I see that process has begun. It's a time-based process. It's, you know, something that
we have to keep chipping away at the blocks. I think what's important here is what we have to keep is what we care about at the center of the conversation, and work towards that center. I think for me, that's really what I would say is the nature of my practice, which I would, pose the same question to you, because I think in many ways you're working in a more difficult set of conditions. Working in Europe, I'm now working in Europe or working in England. I've worked in England, and things are quite tight. I mean, it's quite compressed, regulations, what you can do, what you can't do. And it's not easy. And then there's, of course, your time and economy, and then, the contracts, and you have to operate, trying to find a balance in managing all of that. And at the same time, you still have to find a way or a means to make something that is meaningful for the very fact that what you're doing. And I'm curious, your views on that, because I think from my position, I find that there's greater difficulty in the place that you work than maybe where I work. At least this is the notion that I get.
I mean, the kind of regulatory framework here is for sure more restrictive, but I think there's something more kind of existential at stake here, which is, there's clearly a new urgency for radical change. There has to be, whether it's environment, whether it's housing, whether it's the way we care for our elderly. There are so many, and race, there are so many areas where we have to affect radical change. And yet we have to, and it speaks to what you just mentioned, that, you can only, in a way, you can only chip away, and we have to be patient, but there is an urgency. And I'm kind of wrestling at the moment with how we reconcile this. How do we push for radical change? How do we initiate it? How do we participate in it? And but at the same time, we must really take time to reflect, to consult, to speak with, a whole range of different communities, different institutions, different organizations. One thing that I've kind of relished from this period of lockdown is the kind of slower pace to life, a sort of different rhythm that has been created, which, I, for one, I'm going to find quite hard to give that up. And I think many people share my feelings. But I see you in your practice as somebody who has embraced that way of kind of waiting, and I think you've spoken about this, but waiting for things to come to you rather than going after something. And I would really like to find a project that we could work on together, where we could come from these two very different places, because there are many aspects to your work and your ethos that are kind of shared by my practice, but we come from such different positions in a sense. And this, the elevation of craft, the importance of storytelling and narrative through a project, and the relationship between man and material, and that kind of brings me to the work, your project for your pavilion, for MPavilion, and I know that the concept of law is very important to you, and this handing down of stories and this kind of intangible knowledge, intangible kind of handing down of knowledge, but that becomes very real. And maybe could you speak a little bit about that and how that played out in MPavilion, and how the transfer of both materials and culture from Mumbai to Melbourne was, you know, it was clearly not without its challenges, and how has that informed then your work at a deeper level?
So for me, when I talk about lore, it's more of, and I would say this is applicable to all of us. You know, we're all built on stories. You know, each one of us is an artifact built on some story. You know, something that has, you know, situations or relationships that have met, you know, that have been in dialogue or in conversation, and that have then through that created something. You know, and so I look at, you know, that each one of is a construct of that idea of lore, and that idea of more than passing on. I think this idea of continuity. You know, this idea of something that has movement, and that has a movement through time. You know, and something that also remains in the present, not something necessarily of the past or the future, but it sort of accommodates this whole condition of time. And for me, the Melbourne Pavilion, it was interesting because for me, what was important, you know, given the location of the pavilion where it was located, the actual imprint of the original settlers were the Aborigines, were the original, you know, inhabitants of Australia. And I just happened to move from my old studio, you know, after 17 years, about 17 years. And I'd moved to a piece of land that I was, you know, just a temporary parcel of land, which was right adjacent to an Aboriginal settlement, but from my region, from here. They were basically forest dwellers. They were called Adivasi. And, you know, within a span of 2 weeks, I had to produce something. I had to make a shelter for myself, accommodate, you know, 17 years worth of work, 23 dogs, you know, cats, and, you know, trees and plants and people. And it was just like literally moving an entire community in a very short period of time. And actually, that was the first time that I made contact, you know, where I saw, and just this whole notion of an architecture built without noise. You know, I'm saying that it was an architecture built with the sound of breathing, you know, and that was, for me, what was characteristic about, you know, the intention behind the MPavilion. It was to make that original contact and to demonstrate the idea that I think we just take it now, you know, that the noise, the machines, not that I'm, you know, averse to the machines or, you know, or to technology or to science, but just to sort of question the idea that, you know, to make a pavilion or to make a space or to make a shelter that, you know, uses the construct of sound in a very different way, you know, and that's why I said the sound of breathing.
Yeah. But that is a very beautiful poetic notion, an architecture without noise. I mean, that is so beautiful. But I just want to, okay, and the sound of breathing, and actually that goes back to what you were talking about with respect to the high rise, and this idea that the high rise can be a more, you know, letting more air in, letting more light in, a kind of deeper breath.
More porous, no? Just more porous. You know, the lung. Its lung capacity. You sort of increase its lung capacity. That's
but do you believe? And you said you know. Do you believe that we can find? And I feel this really strongly, that we have to search for better ways of reconciling nature and technology, because what you're talking about for MPavilion is really is not technology. It's working with nature. It's working with natural materials and techniques that have been developed over generations. But are you interested to look at how we could
Absolutely.
bring technology into that, and how we could really come up with a new typology, whether it's a Mumbai typology or a London typology, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for me, the intent and the practice is to find links, or to find the bridges, you know, to make those conduits of contact. You know, it's not, you know, for me, I think technology, and again, I mean, it's, so, but first let me just pause here and say that, and this is something I was in conversation with you know, a friend of mine from Milan, and there was also this big show in Milan in the Trinale called Broken Nature. I don't know, you know, Antonelli. And it's sort of, I was thinking about it, and I think what's happened is the nature that's been broken is ours. It's our nature that we're eroding. You know, we always externalize nature as something that is extant to us. It's outside of us. You know, when you see, because I think what we've begun to observe, and you know, I think intuitively understand, is, you know, why this relationship with trees, why a relationship with a rock, a mountain, or water, or flora and fauna. And I've always looked at them as, you know, they're large capacitors, like these, like, you know, when I say capacitor, they have this incredible resource to hold our energy. So I think we have to point at, you know, which is the nature we want to fix. So that's one thing, coming to one thing, you know, they are quite happy, and that's been demonstrated just in these last few months, about how, you know, we've seen flora and fauna just like sort of return. You know, Hyde Park, I just got a picture just this morning from a friend of mine, and Hyde Park is completely lush and green. It has been, you know, it's completely, so what I mean, that's the sheer energy of what we call nature, you know, and I think we have to begin to mimic that. We have to begin to make contact with that. So coming to this idea of collaboration, absolutely, this, you know, because in the MPavilion that you've constructed, it sort of really takes a very it's sophisticated, and yet it is not, because it's sort of, you've built these extremely delicate, you know, tree-like structures, and I know, I mean, I know a little bit about carbon fiber building, because I used to make surfboards a long time ago, but that was another life. So I do have a sense, but it's interesting that you tapped into a boat building industry in Australia. And for me, it's the same thing, this idea of lore, this idea of technology. And I'm curious about how you were able to articulate this notion of a tree. You know, if I'm correct in my understanding about the pavilion, and you know, and if you could sort of talk about that, because you also, I remember in a conversation between ourselves, you talked about this idea of a sway, you know, that you wanted to. And I'm saying this, I'm asking this because I think that's where, you know, maybe it's the expression that differs, but I think the intention and the location of where this work is being produced from is the same. So, you know, for me, yes, absolutely, the collaboration would be something quite exciting, because it would lead to some kind of a very curious hybrid. But I think I'm curious to know a little bit more about, you know, how the whole conceptual idea of the MPavilion, and how you're able to translate that into technology and structure.
Well, you know, our starting point was the tree. Our starting point was nature, and the tree is a natural place for people to gather, whether they're seeking shade or shelter from the wind or shelter from the rain, to have a picnic under dappled light. And could we somehow could we mimic nature? You know, you were talking about that, but using technology. And because the brief for MPavilion is so free, and that's one of the beauties of it as a project, and it gives you such kind of liberty. Could we design a structure that was so seemingly fragile that it literally sways in the wind, because that is the beauty of a tree, the power of a tree, but it still moves. And that is why we chose to work with a company who started off in the boat building industry, and were very fluent and knowledgeable about carbon fiber and composites. And we had a hunch of how to do it. And what we visualized at the very beginning was very close to what we ended up with. But the journey was far from straightforward, and it was completely dependent on the commitment of the individuals who embarked on this journey, to which we did not know the answer at the beginning of the project. And although they work with very high-tech materials, they have an innate sense of craftsmanship, a deep understanding of materials, and it was really a process of trial and error that led to the final structure and the final kind of nature of these petals. So it was a deeply collaborative process with the makers. There was no way we could have imagined that was exactly how. We had a hunch, but we didn't know how to do it. And it was I love to work with people in that way, and we are very demanding of our collaborators. But it means we have there is a real exchange. There is a real kind of equality about the way in which we work and exchange ideas. And I think that, I see that is how you work with, whether it's stonemason, it's this starting point of having a real, a deep respect for the people that are making, is kind of fundamental to being able to push the limits of things.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's interesting. I mean, this whole idea of craftsmanship, or this notion of what it is to make something, and I think the best way. I mean, I'm more and more curious about this aspect about, what is the energy that you embody into what is being made. I think that's, for me, the more important part. Not so much necessarily about the person itself. They're more vehicles, or we are all vehicles that, I'm like, what for me is very important, I think more and more now is, how do we make spaces that embody a certain energy? It's called embodied energy. So when I think about nature, or if I think of trees or water or these phenomena in nature, they resonate with a certain energy. And for me, this idea, whether it's a stonemason or a carpenter, or materials for that matter, just materials by their very nature itself, then how do you bring them together in a sort of configuration that then has the resonance? I think, because architecture has the capacity to create resonance. And I think that's something that I've experienced. I had the good fortune of seeing your pavilion. I did see Sean's pavilion, in a different location. Yours I saw twice. Once was in the location of where the MPavilion, where it was first instated, and then when it was relocated. And for me, I think also the other thing you did bring up was this idea of liberty, or the whole MPavilion project. For me, it's a sort of interesting platform because it's a very open space, both physically and metaphorically. It's impressive how Naomi's been able to handle 6 architects. It's not an easy endeavor, with each one coming with a sort of set of thought processes and thinking. And for me, I've been thinking about that, to have the ability to sort of remain open
participate, uh, with a certain rigor and allow for that expression to occur. Uh, I think that energy is also very much part of this project, the MPavilion project. It's very much a intrinsic
Yeah.
aspect of, the creator in some way, that has enabled for this phenomena, if I say, to occur.
But it
But
is.
yeah, I mean, I think, sorry.
No. Well, I was just saying, I'm trying to hold on to this idea of the energy being the kind of the thing that is really going to make a project. But is it another way of describing it? Is it not about desire and desiring to make a difference, to I don't know,
I would say for me, no, it's less a desire, but more the opportunity, in the same way that I've received, to, and I don't want to say give back either, to pass on, to pass forward. Is there something I can, that through my actions, through what I do, uh, that I can make a provision, or I can make a space where there, at a later point in time, in some way, for palimpsest, I don't even know who these people are going to be, or what they might even look like, or where they're even from. But to provide a space or an opportunity where you can springboard from that. And that's the only sort of focus for me, is, somewhere to drive the work into it. In some way, that's what was for me very important, this idea of connecting back to the core, connecting back to the land, because it was water in that region that made them settle in that space, the Aborigines, the original settlers. And so for me, I think it's very fundamental. It's just that continuous pursuit. I mean, I'm doing a project, I've been drawing it up as we speak right now. And this is in South Tyrol, in Südtirol, in the Scilia, on the border of Australia, southern Italy. And it's about winter, it's about the snow, but it's also about the summer and the sun. So it's got these two very extreme conditions. And so out there, for me, it's the importance of fire, it's the importance of heat, the warmth, that becomes the core of the work. And in some ways, for me, the foundation, in a sort of, again, in a metaphor, it's about this notion of fire that becomes a sort of central hearth. And that's really the rest of the project over time will give away and fall away, or dismantle, but something still remains where you can, and that becomes a sort of the anchor, or the core that allows a sort of reconfiguration to occur. And for me, it's that notion, of that aspect, is what I've experienced of my experience of architecture, and it's something that I'm continuously fascinated with. There were these Buddhist caves that were built in the 5th century, and sometimes even dating before that. And when I go to these, I visited it last year, and it's interesting because right now it's taken by the Archaeological Survey of India. It's cordoned off. It's not cordoned off, but it doesn't function in the intent it was meant to function. But yet, even in its strapping, even if in its strapping as in being held and constricted, it still reverberates with that energy. And I've seen people interact with that space, which, it's amazing that how over a period of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, something has the capacity to still remain alive. And I think for me, that's really what I would say is passing on. That's the idea for me of continuity. It reminds me of this fresco by Piero della Francesca, and I speak a lot about this. This was the resurrection of Christ. Aldous Huxley wrote about this him seeing the greatest picture in the world in the town of San Sepolcro, and it survived basically being defaced by the very people that commissioned him, the city that commissioned him or the town that commissioned him, and 2 world wars. You know, so what is it that empowers that work? You know, what is that? What is it? What is the energy that empowers that work for it to even resonate through these very extreme conditions? Because I think, and this is something that I'm certain about it, is that as long as we continue, as long as, and we will, I mean, that we have to work with gravity, you know, that's sort of fundamentally, you know, gravity is what creates this kind of movement, this kind of flux that we're seeing. And for me, it's this idea of how do you neutralize, how do you make spaces that can accommodate the situation that we're in today. You know, how can it hold the space, even as extreme as what we're being confronted with? You know, we've survived wars, you know, over generations, you know, so we're in that sense quite resilient, you know. And I think for me, the desire, if there is one, is to work with the notion of passing on, this idea of continuity. Can we leave certain things in a way that others can pick up and build from? I think for me, that's really, I would say, the sort of central premise of, you know, how I'm working.
I think that's a really beautiful kind of moment to maybe end our conversation. There's this idea that we're striving for something that will remain alive. I mean, that's a very profound and very beautiful notion. And I hope that, you know, a lovely thing to come out of this conversation will be that we develop a kind of, it has across the airwaves for now until we're able to meet, but a kind of Mumbai-London collaboration to explore the limits of a problematic typology like the high-rise for living.
Yes, I think it would be wonderful to collaborate on a project, you know, and I've always been very curious with Ledoux and Boulez and the drawings and the sort of thinking that went behind the work that they produced. And, you know, just hypothetically to provide for or to imagine possibilities would be a sort of task that would be wonderful to participate in. I think we have to sort of continue this conversation and see where, you know, what comes from that.
And so thank you, Naomi, for introducing us and for commissioning us both to do this great project. And what a pleasure to talk, really. So
thank you. Yes, absolutely. It's been a great journey, if I would say, you know, just in terms of, and it still sort of lives on. It's not like, you know, you build the pavilion, it's done, but the very fact that there's a book and there's conversation and I think endure. It's something that continues. Endurance is ability to have a momentum to continue. So thank you. And we should remain in touch.
Yeah, okay, we'll definitely remain in touch. Thank you.